Begin this morning by reading from 1 Peter chapter number 3, verses 1 through 6. Likewise, wives, be subject to your own husbands, so that even if some do not obey the word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives, when they see your respectful and pure conduct. Do not let your adorning be external, the braiding of hair, the putting on of gold jewelry, or the clothing you wear, but let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart, with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious. For this is how the holy women who hoped in God used to adorn themselves, by submitting to their own husbands, as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. And you are her children, if you do good and do not fear anything that is frightening. Remember that when Peter began his letter, he spent an extended amount of time telling new believers who they are. He wanted to establish the identity of this group of people who had recently come to know Christ, become Christians. And he wanted to let them know who they are. They are children born into the family of God. They are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation. They are God's own people. They are set free from the traditions that they have come from, the culture that they have been in, and they are now to live for God. And so he really wants to spend time establishing this, especially since this faith, Christianity, is a new thing. And the people who are receiving this letter are trying to figure out who they are and what that means in the world that they live in, a world that is not used to Christianity and doesn't look particularly favorably upon it. And so he tells them who they are, and then he begins to look at how we, or they and we now, as people of God, are to live in the world. And beginning in chapter 2, he begins to list various authorities that we live in, the authority structures that we live under. And he wants to stress that we are to live within these authority structures as given from God, but we are not identified by them. We are not. These structures are not where we get our primary identity. That comes from God Himself. That's why he spends so much time in the beginning of the letter laying out who we are. Our primary loyalty, our primary obedience, our allegiance is given to God, first and foremost, at all times. In chapter 3, he gives one of these authority structures that's not particularly popular in this day and time, not politically correct, if you will, in which he tells us wives are to be in submission to their husbands. He says, wives, be subject to your own husbands. Now, the Bible consistently teaches that in a marriage is a thing indeed that is instituted by God directly from the very beginning. It is the first social structure that we find on earth, and it is given directly by God. And in this marriage, this thing that God put together, the husband is to provide leadership. The husband is to be the one to lead the family, and the wife is to follow. Now, this is not, as I've said many times before, this is not signify value. It does not mean that the husband is the more valuable person, more valuable than a wife or a woman. And Peter will make that clear in the next section when he addresses husbands. So it is not that one is more valuable than the other. This is simply the structure that God has given to the family, and it reflects Himself and how He works in the world. So this is the given structure of the family. Now, there are arguments in this that are given in light of 1 Peter chapter 3, which try to argue that this is not what Peter is after. He's not really telling wives that they need to be in submission to their husbands. And there are quite a few arguments that are given. But let me give one of the most common ones, and I give this one because it actually helps bring out a point that I think Peter is trying to make. One thing that is often said And I said, this is tied to the culture in which Peter is writing. This is a sort of a cultural command. This is how the time and thought of Peter's day, especially to the areas he's writing, this was how families were structured, and Peter's just working within the cultural context that he finds himself in. But once that cultural context changes, then this command is no longer relevant. So in today's culture, where talking about a husband's leadership in the family, that's not a common thing. It's not a popular thing. We can sort of set that aside and find other ways to go about a husband and wife relating to one another. But this cultural argument ignores the fact that one of the whole points of Peter writing the letter is that Christians are set free from their cultural context. They are no longer bound by the traditions, he says, by the traditions of your fathers. These cultural things are not what identify. You have a new culture. You have a new identity that comes from Christ. You have a new allegiance from God. Peter is countercultural in many ways. So it would seem odd that he sort of kowtows to his culture while trying to be countercultural. He insists that we as Christians are alien and exile in the culture that we find ourselves. In fact, his countercultural push continues in this command to wives. He says, be subject to your own husbands, so that even if some of them do not obey the word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives. So he says, wives, be subject to your husbands, even if some of them do not obey the word, even if some of them are not believers, which is a thing which might happen. As Christianity spreads to this area, it might be that a wife becomes a Christian while the husband does not. Now, this would be very countercultural. In this area, in this day, a wife simply adopted and followed the gods of her husband. Whatever the husband would have worshipped, the wife would have worshipped. And Peter's saying, you don't have to do that. Indeed, you shouldn't do that. If your husband is not a believer, you should still worship the one true God. You should follow God. And this would have not been accepted culturally. Peter says that the wife, once again, is to find her primary allegiance to God, which gives her an independence and a freedom in Christ. So clearly, when he says, be subject to your husbands, he's not commanding a mindless obedience to every command and every whim of the husband. He's saying, follow God. And part of following God is following as much as you can the structure that he, not culture itself, that he has put into the world, where the husband is to be the leader of the family. But like every other authority structure, be subject only as long as you can do so without obeying God. God is your primary allegiance, not to the husband, but first to God. And then in following God, as much as you can, be in submission to the husbands. So for wives of unbelieving husbands, submit as far as possible without disobeying God. And this is what Peter asks of the wives. But this has more of a purpose than just obeying God. When he talks about submitting to governments, which he also commands Christians to do, he says one of the reasons for doing that, submitting to governments, is to shut the mouths of the foolish. Another way of saying, be a witness by following the authority structures as much as you can. Be a witness to unbelievers. Show them your obedience. Show them that you're not just sort of rebellious, angry people. Be a witness to people. This is part of being a royal priesthood. And the wives of unbelieving husbands are to do this as well. When Peter says we are a royal priesthood, I usually like to talk about it as saying um, we represent God to a people. What people do we represent God to? Well, the unbelieving world. As a church, as the Christ body, we are a royal priesthood. We represent God to the world, and Peter's concerned with how we do that. And in the case of the wife, she is to be a part of this royal priesthood by representing God to her husband, and he's concerned with how she does that. So Peter says that husbands can be won by respect and pure conduct of the wife. It is the purity of the wife's devotion first to God and her respect for her husband that may win her husband to follow God. And he insists this is how it's to be done. And he insists it's not done through seduction. He says it's not done through adorning the external by braiding of hair, wearing the golden jewelry, through the clothes that she wears. This is not how the husband is to be won to the faith. Now this is not a blanket ban on these things or a ban on taking care of your appearance. He's not banning all the things he mentioned. One of the things he mentions is wearing clothes. He's not banning wearing clothes. I assume he expects us to wear clothes. The point here is, do not try to win the husband to externals. It is not the external that we're trying to win a husband to, but to the deep beauty of God's work in a wife's life. This is what is to draw them to God. This is what is to appeal to the husband and draw them to faith. So he wants the wife to be careful how she goes about representing God to the husband. Now, I will make a point here. He says that the husband may be won by the wife's conduct. I will add, it is not this responsibility is not put on the wife's shoulder for the husband's conversion. In other words, it's not if the husband does not convert, it's not a failure on the wife's part. It's not she doesn't convert the husband. This can be sometimes I've seen it to be a wife of a unbelieving husband feel guilt because somehow they weren't good enough, their conduct wasn't good enough, and if they'd just gotten it right, their husband would have converted. And Peter's not saying that if you get it right, the husband will convert. It's not God is the one who converts, and that is between the husband and God. But Peter says when you go about trying to win your husband, do it through proper conduct, the purity of your life, from following God first and being respectful to your husband. I will also note that the church has always taught that if this submission does not include simple submission and acceptance of abuse, and that's not your first. Once again, your first allegiance is to God, and it's not healthy and good for a husband to be abusive, and you need not put him in a position where he does that. And it's really the church's responsibility when a Christian wife is being abused. Well, any wife is being abused, to step in and try to help that. So it is not saying just take your lumps with abuse and put up with it. So those are, I think, important caveats to include here. So Peter says, wives, this is the structure God's given. Be submissive to your husbands, even if that husband is not a Christian, and try to win them to God, not through externals. That's not the avenue that will bring them to faith. It is through the purity and goodness of your conduct, holy living. Now, community and family are very important to Peter, and he likes to remind us that when we follow God, when we keep his commandments, we are in a community. And this would have been very important to these new believers who had a very small community of believers, if they were in a community at all. And they probably felt very alone at times, on their own, in a larger social context that did not follow Christ, were very wary of it, or didn't like it even. And so they probably felt very alone. They were aliens and exiles. And Peter tries often to remind us that we are not alone. We're not the first people to have to go through this. We are part of a community of believers that extends through time. And for wives, he does this as well. He says, to the wives, he points them to Sarah as being their ancestor in the faith, and those who live well and rightly in their families. So he says, you're part of this fellowship. This is your lineage. And he encourages them, he encourages wives to be a part of the fellowship of, as he puts it, holy women who hoped in God, adorning themselves by submitting to their husbands. He says, as you do this, you're not alone. You're part of a community of women that extends centuries, millennia back through time, who live life as God in their families, as God ordained it. Now, next week, we're going to move to Peter's words to husbands. And these are very sharp, and it's a sort of a short, quick, and very powerful punch to husbands. And we will look at that next week. So, in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit.